Hey, what's up guys? Calum or Calum's Fish Tanks, and today we're talking about how to set up your first CO2 system. Now I know a lot of people are pretty scared by CO2, but it's really not that hard, and today I'm going to walk you through all the steps. Don't be scared, CO2 is easy. I'm going to talk about what things you need to buy, and I'm going to have a list of products down and below in the description if you're interested. I'm going to tell you guys about how to prevent killing your fish. A lot of people worry about this one, and it's not that hard. You don't have to worry about this too much, and it's really a rare case where CO2 will kill your fish. And I'm also going to talk about how much you need to put in and how to figure out how much you need for your tank. A lot of people are like, how many bubbles per second do I need? And that isn't really an accurate way of measuring things because every tank's different, and you got to find that out for yourself, and I'm going to teach you guys how to do that. And as well as I'm going to talk about a little bit of tips and tricks as well. So let's get started. So let's start off with the materials you're going to need to buy. The most important is a regulator. A lot of regulators, some you can find super cheap, but the problem with these is they're usually used for things like kegs, and they're not really used for the aquarium hobby. I'd recommend looking into something like a Milwaukee or another trusted brand. I'm going to have a Milwaukee regulator down below, which is a good budget option. Isn't super expensive, but gets the job done, and I've used them in the past. Another option, if you're looking for, more fancy, could be something like CO2 art, but those are pretty expensive. And honestly, all these regulators are pretty good. The first one I got was, I think, called Dici, and I got that from a local fish store, and it's lasted me 4 years so far, and I've never had to replace anything, and all my plants are happy downstairs in my 40-gallon breeder. Now you can also go for a paintball regulator and a paintball canister, but that's something I don't really have experience in, so I'm not going to talk about on that. But stick around because I do have a lot of other useful tips, especially when it comes to dialing in CO2, which is something a lot of beginners have the most questions about. So after you get your CO2 regulator, you're also going to need a CO2 canister. Now bigger is always better. On my big 40-gallon breeder, I think it's about 20 pounds, so it was quite expensive to start with, but I have to fill the thing up every 9 months about, so it lasts me a long time. And for a 5-gallon canister, it cost me $26 to fill, and that big one cost me about $32, and it lasts way longer. So if you can afford a bigger one right away, I would go for a bigger CO2 canister to start. It will save you more money in the long run. Next up, you're going to need some kind of tubing. I just use airline tubing. There's a lot of conflicting information out there. A lot of people are worried that airline tubing will allow CO2 to leak through. But honestly, most hobbyists will never get to enough pressure to the point where it will leak through. So you don't really have to worry about that. I just use airline tubing on all my tanks, and I've never had any problem. And you can get a big roll of it for like $5, and it'll be perfectly fine for using for your CO2 setup. You're also going to need a diffuser. In smaller tanks under about 40 gallons, you can get away with using just a little atomizer, something like with the ceramic discs. I don't know what they're called. I guess they're just diffusers. But if you're going for a bigger tank, you're going to need something like a reactor or an inline diffuser to get better spread of your CO2. In all my tanks, I just use little diffusers I found for like 20 bucks, and they work great for me. But if you're using CO2 in a bigger tank, you're going to need to get something like an inline diffuser or a CO2 reactor. These next two items are super important. The first one is a check valve. This you put at the water level of the tank, so it would be about right here. What this does is when the CO2 turns off, water siphons back in through the tube when it loses pressure. So if you have a check valve, it'll prevent water from going down into your regulator, which would ruin it. So you need a check valve, and it's better to put it at the water level so the tube fills up with less water, so it's easier for your CO2 to pump it back out when your CO2 turns back on. The next item you're going to need that's very important is a timer, and those CO2 regulators I mentioned come with solenoids, which basically allows you to plug in the regulator and have it turn off without having to turn the dial all the way down and all the way back up, because fluctuating CO2 is not great for plants and can cause algae. So you're going to want a solenoid on that regulator, which almost all of them come with, as well as a timer to hook this up so it's turning on and off at the same time every day. One thing I forgot to mention, because most regulators come with one already, is a bubble counter. So if you're going like with the Milwaukee I mentioned earlier, that will come with a bubble counter, and you don't have to worry about buying one of those. And a lot of diffusers also sometimes come with one, but a bubble counter is something you need if it's not coming with one of the things you've already bought already. So that does it for all the materials you need to set it up: a regulator, a tank, some tube, a diffuser, a check valve, and a timer. And maybe a bubble counter as well. So 6 things, and I don't know how much exactly this will run you. Canadian, it's about 300 bucks. American, it's probably quite a bit less, honestly. Now let's talk about horror stories and gassing your fish. This is something that is easily avoidable. Whenever you switch how much pressure your CO2 is at, you gotta be around the tank. Your fish will show visible signs of being stressed. You'll see them at the top of the water. If you see them acting funny when you're first setting up your CO2, just turn it down a little and put your filter above the water line like this, and get some more oxygen in the water. And this will cancel out the CO2 and hopefully help your fish get back to normal. But like I mentioned, when you're adjusting your CO2, you gotta be home. Check every half an hour or so to see how your fish are reacting to it and seeing if it's negatively affecting them. When it is at the top of the water, when your fish are at the top of the water, it's time to turn down the CO2 and crank the flow up, and maybe add an air stone if you have one to get some of that CO2 out, and don't really mess with it for the rest of the day. Now let's talk about how to know how much CO2 to pump into your tank. Now there's two different methods to do it. One's a little bit more reliable, the other one I use more often. It's a little bit riskier, but it's a little bit more accurate. So the first thing you can use is what's called a drop checker. So it's that little thing right here, which is basically a little glass thing, and you put solution, you put it like this. And then you add solution in and then turn it, and it'll fall into this ball, and this will change colors depending on how much CO2 you have in the aquarium. So when it's blue, you don't have enough CO2. When it's green, you have the right amount, and if it's yellow, you have too much. The only problem with this thing is they're about 2 hours behind or so for the change to start showing. So it takes a little while for them to properly read how much CO2 you have in your aquarium. Now when I started with CO2, I didn't know about one of these little drop checkers. That's what they're called, drop checkers. I will put a link to one down below in the description. So what I did was a different method. So what I would do was I'd turn up my CO2 a little tiny bit every day and see how the fish react. If the fish would go up to the water, I would turn it down, but it was such minute changes, the fish never got up to the water. So I'd do it a little bit, and then I'd let it sit for the whole day, and then the next day I'd do it again to see if the fish are acting any different. And then they'd be fine another one, so I'd turn it a little bit more up the next day, and so on until my fish start to show stress. So the thing is, you have to be around your tank when you do this, like I mentioned. Checking the tank every 20-15 minutes. I set alarms on my phone to make sure I'd go and check them, and this let me dial in the CO2 to a level that's probably a bit higher than when this little thing would turn green. So it's probably about 35 parts per million, but it's low enough that my fish are not being harmed. And this is the way a lot of people told me about doing it, and it worked pretty well for me. I didn't kill any fish. You just have to remember to check your fish. They're gonna tell you when they're having too much CO2, and if, say, they do get to the top of the water, you're probably gonna have like about an hour or so to fix things, even if you're cranking that CO2 pretty high. So say you're doing it a very small amount every day, and you're like 5 days in, stay around that a bit more. But early stages, if you keep it really low, you'd probably have to check maybe once or twice a day, not all that often. Now you can use bubbles per second as like a starting. So if your tank is about over 20 gallons, maybe start at about 1 bubble per second and see how your fish react to that. And if it's too high, turn it down. Too low, turn it up a tiny bit. But say you have like a 40 gallon, do 2, and so on and so forth, and just kind of see how your tank reacts, because every tank is different. There's no set rule for how many bubbles per second you're going to need to be adding. The main ways to do it are with this little drop checker and seeing how your fish react. If you don't have fish in the tank, the drop checker is the best method to go with. Now I didn't really show how to set this up, but what you're going to want to do is take your CO2 canister and use a crescent wrench to screw on your regulator. From there, if you have a bubble counter, it should have an area for the airline tubing to connect to, and from there you're going to attach your check valve and then your diffuser. It's a very simple method, and you're going to want to plug that into a timer as well, and then you're all set up. You want to turn on your CO2 about 1 hour before your lights turn on, and that gives your tank a chance to build up enough CO2 so that when the lights do turn on, there's CO2 available in the water for plants. You also want the CO2 to turn off an hour before your lights turn off. And this just allows for enough CO2 to disperse, because CO2 will lower the pH, and it'll allow your plants to use up the rest of that CO2 so your pH can go back to normal overnight when the plants aren't using that CO2, so no CO2 is built up in the tank for the next day. There's also things like pH controllers you can use, and if you're using one of those, I'd recommend dropping the pH by about 1 whole unit. So for example, my 20 gallon long, the pH is about 6.5, so I drop my pH down to 5.5. And a lot of you are probably thinking that's extremely low, but these pH drops with CO2 are less deadly as long as you can get your pH back up to where it is normally. So how I do that is when my lights turn off, I have an air stone coming on that builds up a lot of oxygen in the water and creates a lot of flow to get my CO2 and pH back to normal levels overnight so my fish aren't asphyxiated. If you're still scared from watching this video of CO2, you don't have to do it. You can still make a beautiful planted tank without CO2. The one beside me right here, this whole video, it doesn't have any CO2 on it. It's a little bit harder to work on a tank without CO2. Your plants will grow a lot slower and you're gonna have to be a bit more patient, but it's still doable. And if you don't wanna spend the money, you can still do a low-tech tank and have success in this hobby. You don't need to do CO2, but a lot of people do want to, and they wanna take the next step, and CO2 is a great thing to have in a planted aquarium for sure. Hopefully this video calmed the nerves a little bit about CO2. It's not that scary. It's definitely still a little scary, but it's not that bad once you get into it and get it set up. It's something you set once you get it set up and forget about it. Never have to worry about it again until you have to fill it up. But anyways guys, thank you guys so much for watching. This was Calum's Fish Tanks. Peace.